All right, so we're going to be solving radical equations by hand and using technology. This should sound familiar. It is a little familiar, but we want to get a little practice in so that we are feeling good about moving forward when we start looking at more complex real-world situations. When solving a radical equation, what are the steps that you will take to solve for a given variable? So on your own, pause the video and jot down the steps that you think are important. So I bet the number one thing that people said were that you're going to need to square both sides. Right? That's how we are going to get our variable out from inside our radical. Right? Because squaring is the inverse of square rooting, and so that is a great step to take. But there's also a step that you might have written down before that, which is that you want to isolate the radical. And that's important because if you square both sides before you isolate the radical, right, well then we're squaring something in addition to the radical. So we got to make sure that we isolate first. Okay, so let's go ahead and try one. Here's one right here. Go ahead and try it out, pause the video, and we'll take a look at it in 1 second. All right, so we want to isolate the radical. So what we're going to do is we're going to subtract 1 from both sides. It's going to leave us with 3x equals 2 times the square root of x. And then we can continue isolating the radical by dividing by 2 on both sides. So I'll have 3/2 x. Right, 3 divided by 2, or 3x divided by 2. And I could write this in a different way too. Right? I could write 3x over 2 or 1.5 times x. Either way, it means the same thing. And on the right side, I'll have the square root of x. And so at this point, I can go ahead and square both sides. Remember, I got to square everything. And the reason that I left it as 3 over 2 is because that makes it a little easier. So 3 over 2 squared, all right, remember I distribute this in, I'm squaring both of these things. Well, 3 squared is 9 and 2 squared is 4. So I'll have 9/4 x squared equals x. And here you're like, well, how do I solve for this? And what you've got to recognize is that this is going to be a quadratic. And so if you set a quadratic equivalent to 0, you can use the quadratic formula. So I'm going to subtract x from both sides, and I'm going to end up with 9/4 x squared minus x equals 0. And so now I can go use my quadratic formula to solve this, and I want you to pause the video and go give that some practice, and we'll take a look at the answer in just a couple of seconds. So I've started off. You remember, of course, that the quadratic formula allows you to solve for x when you have a quadratic set equal to 0. So here's the initial setup. This ends up being 0 here, so it's 1 minus 0, which is 1. Square root of 1 is 1. So I have 1 plus or minus 1 divided by 2 times 9/4. Well, 2 over 4 is 1 over 2. So this becomes 9/2. So I have 1 plus or minus 1 over 9/2. And what I can do is I can simplify that. This is the same as, right, 1 divided by 9/2 plus or minus 1 divided by 9/2. 1 divided by 9/2, remember, dividing by a fraction is the same as multiplying by its reciprocal. So I multiply 1 by 2/9. Well, 1 times anything is just that something. Same thing over here. And so I'll have that x is equal to, and let's imagine this were the plus version first, 2/9 plus 2/9 is 4/9. Or x equals 2/9 minus 2/9 is 0. So those are the two solutions. Okay, a little bit of work there, and what you can do is you can plug these back in and check that they work. So you could plug in 0. 0 works really easily. 3 times 0 is 0. Square root of 0 is 0, so 2 times 0 is 0. So I have 1 equals 1. And if you plug in 4/9, I will leave that for you to do on your own. It will also work. All right, so let's go ahead and move on and take a look at a few more. So these are for you to go ahead and do. I want you to move through each one, show all your work, and here's the great thing. We can use Wolfram Alpha to check our solutions with a graph, right? So remember that when you are trying to figure out, and I'll use this first one as an example, when something is equal to something else, right? These are both expressions. I can think of this as when the expression f of x is equal to the function g of x. And what I can do is I can go graph each side and see where the two intersect, right? We've discussed this before. So solve it by hand first, and then use Wolfram Alpha. You can say graph, you can say plot, you can ask it to actually solve this equation, and check that your solutions work, right? Make sure that you don't have any extraneous solutions going on. I'll post the solutions quickly and talk about just one of them. All right, so there are the solutions. I do want to talk about number 4 because when you're going through and you're trying to solve this, you probably notice that I can't really isolate, the radical because there's 2 of them. So, when I isolate one, well then there's one on the other side. And it turns out there's 2 ways to attack this. So the first way, both of them involve the first step. The first way is to square both sides just as it is. So what I would do is I would take square root of x plus square root of x plus 3 equals 3. And what I would do is I would square both sides. Well, when you square this left side here, you have to FOIL this out. So you actually have to multiply square root of x plus square root of x plus 3 by itself again. But what you'll notice is, for example, when you do the first, when you multiply square root of x by square root of x again, you're just going to get x. And on the last term, you're going to multiply x plus 3 times itself. You're just getting x plus 3. And the only term that now is going to have a square root is the middle term, which is going to have a square root. And you can actually then just isolate that square root and do the process again. Another way that you can do it, the second method, is to actually get the square roots on either side of each other. In other words, isolate the most complex square root. So the most complex one is the square root of x plus 3. So what I'll do is I'll isolate the square root of x plus 3 by subtracting the square root of x on both sides. So on the right side, I'll have 3 minus the square root of x. And at this point, then I will square both sides. And so here on the right side, again, you're going to FOIL this out, and I'll go ahead and show you what you're going to end up with on the right side of your equation. When you FOIL this out and you multiply it by itself, you'll have 9. And then you'll have negative 3 times root x twice. So you'll have negative 3 of them and another negative 3 of them. So you'll have negative 6 square root x. And then negative square root of x times negative square root of x, well, negative times negative is a positive, and square root x times square root x is just going to be x. And on the right side here, you're just squaring a square root, so you're going to end up with x plus 3. And at this point, you can solve by isolating this radical and squaring both sides. It's a little bit of work, but you need to know how to do this on your own, and then of course you can check that your solution is x equals 1. Now that we've seen a couple of more complex situations, I want you to give these 3 a try. You now have the machinery to be able to go ahead and solve these by hand, and then you can check your solutions using Wolfram Alpha, and I want you to make sure that you check your solutions using Wolfram Alpha because you're going to want to know how to do that. So 1, 2, and 3, make sure that you post a question or a comment, and I will see you guys tomorrow.